The United States has always been proud of its tradition of free press. This is indeed the hallmark of any system of government that claims to embrace democratic values. The idea of a free press is directly linked to the notion of freedom of speech for the population as a whole. The Constitution's First Amendment makes this explicit. There can be little doubt that the press and the media in the United States are free. They are free to express themselves and publish whatever content they deem of interest to their audience. That content can be fact or fiction. Both are essential. Every society builds its culture by publicly articulating its understanding of political, social, economic, cultural, and even philosophical issues. We expect our news media to report factual information. This provides a grounding for social dialogue. Fiction, in the form of novels, stories, theater, and cinema, exaggerates and distorts the reality we have been exposed to, but it does so in a way that induces reflection not just on facts, but especially on relationships that concern both people and ideas. Are facts as simple as we think? As consumers of news, we have to ask ourselves, how grounded are the facts reported by the media? Any discrete incident can be described in different ways, with different points of emphasis. The reporter is free to give that emphasis. Every fact, everything that happens has multiple causes. This is a point Aristotle brought home more than 2 millennia ago. He claimed that everything in existence has 4 categories of causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. Material and efficient causes are the ones the news talks about. Efficient refers to a condition that causes movement, such as hitting a ball with a bat, slamming on the car brakes, sending an army to invade another nation, or provoking another nation to start a war. Philosophers and metaphysicians debate about formal and final causes. They inhabit the world of abstract thinking. What we non-philosophers need to remember is that any object or any event may have multiple efficient causes. Applying basic logic to understanding the Ukraine war. When informed people discuss the Ukraine war, they may emphasize one of 2 prominent efficient causes to explain the conflict. The obvious one in terms of visible movement, like the bat striking the baseball, is Russia's invasion in early 2022. That is both material and efficient. But many analysts of international relations cite what they see as the principal efficient cause of the invasion. They cite a complex series of events over time that had already turned Ukraine into a de facto member of NATO. The media has the freedom to decide that citing a single efficient cause is sufficient. That is what mainstream Western media have done for the past 2.5 years. In other words, our understanding of freedom of the press means that any media can adopt a strategy that chooses to focus on only one efficient cause, even when there are many others, possibly more fundamental, to consider. We could say that instead of seeking a true efficient cause, they instead choose to identify a sufficient cause. That means that once identified, no further analysis is required. Insisting that the Ukraine war was unprovoked is a perfect example. When the media becomes content with a sufficient cause, physicists might critique this approach by characterizing it as the failure to grapple with the classic 3-body problem. The concept refers to the difficulty of calculating with precision the effect of gravitational force when more than 2 interacting bodies are part of the same gravitational system. Such situations exist everywhere in the universe, as n-body problems. But physics tells us there are no solvable equations even for the simplest 3-body systems. That doesn't mean we can't predict movement. It means there is no reliable mathematical formula to account for movement. When our media reports the news of an accident on the freeway, there may be only 2 bodies involved. For example, one car rear-ending another. But if fog was present at the time of the accident, we should think of it as a 3rd body. If the newscaster fails to mention the fog, the story will take on a different meaning. If the reporter mentions the state of ebriety of one of the drivers or cites a witness who saw a dog crossing the road, the story will take on yet a different meaning. That's why a critical consumer of the news should always consult 2 or more sources before committing to an interpretation, but also seek to understand the discernible bias of the sources before assuming that the story as reported is true. That uncertainty about what one should believe is also why the notion of freedom of the press means accepting that the press is free to underreport the facts, embellish the facts, distort them, and even deny the facts. The concept of freedom allows all those things to happen. That's why we should always think of the question of disinformation as another kind of three-body problem. Consider the fact that a public figure may feel they have a good reason to tell an outright lie. One example of it is President Joe Biden, who solemnly proclaimed in August 2023, "Putin's already lost the war." A year later, all observers admit that it wasn't true, and that it's Ukraine that's on the verge of losing the war. Should the media that reported Biden's statement as if it was official truth be accused of disinformation? No. Even though it could have challenged Biden and failed to do so, the media is not guilty of spreading misinformation. It truthfully reported what Biden said. Should Biden be accused of disinformation? No, because he too is free to announce his personal interpretation of facts. In this case, you might generously say it took the form of wishful thinking. We now need to consider a paradox. The same American political and media culture that sometimes present its wishes as reality has recently assigned itself the moral task of rooting out disinformation. The most ardent proponents of such a campaign, the New York Times, to cite one example, should, in their own reporting, first of all recognize 3 essential components of truthful information: the multiplicity of efficient causes, the complexity of forces at play in a 3-body or more relationship, and the meaning of freedom. Freedom quite simply includes the right to say things that are not true. But endlessly repeating untruths is a sign of moral failure. We might remind ourselves that back in 2019, the executive director of the New York Times admitted privately that its editorial policy had been flat-footed when for several years running it had pushed a story for which it had no solid evidence, the famous thesis known as Russiagate. It asserted Donald Trump had colluded with Vladimir Putin. Even after admitting back then that it had been promoting a lie, the Gray Lady is now at it again. It has uncritically reported the Justice Department's accusation of Russian election interference in the 2024 election. The technique both government and media are using in this instance consists of magnifying the dimensions of the case while neglecting to note that the accusation has the familiar ring of a ploy cherished by DNC strategists in the lead-up to an election. Contrast this with the analysis of several independent commentators who have pointed out how flimsy the evidence is for what is being trumpeted as a serious threat to democracy. They also note how predictable and carefully timed these episodes of strategic lying appear, in this case, just 2 months before the election. We only need think back to the 2020 election, when 51 intelligence experts, Biden himself, and the media openly lied about the reality of Hunter Biden's laptop, claiming the explanation of the story was Russian interference in U.S. elections. Like Biden's assessment of the Ukraine war, that accusation was later proved false. It nevertheless had an effect on the election, since respectable media, including the New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, and CNN, had already conditioned their public to believe that Russian influence was a major factor in U.S. elections. The simple truth is that although foreign interference in all elections is real, it wasn't a major factor then and isn't now. but the media's freedom of speech will allow them to continue creating that false impression. We could hope for better, but it's their right. The real drama today lies in the fact that those same political authorities and media claim to be leading a crusade to stamp out what they call disinformation, which they tend to confound with anything that contradicts or simply critiques the policies and assessments they prefer to put forward. Finding a way out of the dilemma. Freedom of speech is clearly essential to democracy. We will always allow politicians and media to distort the truth and even misreport the news. We can hope they learn the value of truth, but it would be naive to count on their embracing it on all occasions. We should allow ordinary people to do the same, while understanding that they may be distorting the truth out of wishful thinking, like Biden himself. Citizens in a democracy shouldn't fear free speech, nor should they fear censorship. We need to understand that free speech includes the freedom to report what is true, but also to produce fiction or to tell jokes. The burden is now on us and our institutions, especially on our educators, to foster the kind of critical and even philosophical thinking that allows us to distinguish fact from fiction and to appreciate both. After all, Aristotle wrote extensively not only about logic, but also about poetics. So what is critical thinking, and how can we learn to apply it? One way is to understand that any issue we talk about should, at the very least, be treated as a three-body problem. That means systematically seeking to locate and identify a third body, a factor that may have been left out of the accounts you've been exposed to. Once you see the third, you will likely discover a fourth and a fifth. In so doing, whether you realize it or not, you will have entered the privileged domain of critical thinking.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.